We now turn to the apology related to childhood abuse, hunger strikers and statements from the Taoiseach and Taoiseach. And before I call on the Taoiseach, I want to welcome to the distinguished visitors gallery today Mary Dunleavy Green, Mary Donovan, Maurice O'Connell and Miriam O'Connell, all of whom are survivors of institutional abuse. I also want to welcome their friends, family and supporters who, alongside Patricia Carey, the government-appointed Special Advocate for Survivors, have joined us in the public gallery. You're all very welcome. Now calling the Taoiseach.
Thank you, Elaskion Corlin. And I too want to start today by welcoming to Dáil a group of survivors from industrial and reformatory schools who have met with me and with the then Minister for Education, Helen McEntee, to discuss their concerns and to share their individual stories and experiences. And they are, as you have said, Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy Green, Miriam Moriarty-Owens and Maurice Patton O'Connell. I pay tribute to you and I thank you for your advocacy. In May 1999, on the basis of a memo which I brought to Cabinet, the then government agreed to enact a series of steps to give victims of childhood abuse an opportunity to be heard. On behalf of the State and of all citizens of the State, the then government made a sincere apology to the victims of childhood abuse, and on behalf of the State and of all the citizens of the State, that government articulated its wish to make a sincere and long overdue apology to the victims of childhood abuse for our collective failure to intervene, to detect their pain and to come to their rescue. I reiterate that apology today. It was acknowledged then that the process of opening up and acknowledging failures to protect the rights of children would be complex, would take new directions, and demanded a commitment to responding comprehensively. As a country and as a government, we recognise that too many of our children were denied the love, care and security that should have been theirs. Abuse ruined their childhoods and was and remains an ever-present part of their adult lives, reminding them of a time when they were without support or protection. We recognised the gravity of this wrong and undertook to do all we could to overcome the lasting effects of their ordeals. The first major step in a process of seeking full transparency and perspective involved the establishment of the Commission of Investigation into Child Abuse, better known as the Ryan Commission. The final report was published in May 2009. It detailed disturbing and significant levels of historic abuse of children who were placed by the Irish State in residential institutions, particularly industrial schools and reformatories run by religious orders. Ongoing reforms of our childcare laws are essential, and the Childcare Act of 1991 represented a fundamental change of approach to child protection in its comprehensiveness and scope. It prioritised child protection and modernised state services to protect vulnerable children. Irish child protection was significantly transformed and moved to a more proactive state-managed system focused on the rights and safety of the child. And that Act remains the fundamental framework for protecting children. And since then, and in response to the Ryan report and other reports, we have advanced further changes. We now have a comprehensive approach to deal with the traumatic impact of previous abuse, to protect children and to strengthen structures and accountability for child protection in this country. Following the creation of the new Department of Children and Youth Affairs in 2011, the Child and Family Agency, now known as TUSLA, was established in January of 2014. The 31st Amendment of the Constitution Act 2012 was signed into law on the 28th of April 2015. It mandated the courts to consider the best interests of the child as paramount in proceedings regarding custody, guardianship and care. The Children First Act came into effect in 2015. It too broke new ground in vigilance against child abuse and neglect, with mandatory reporting by key professionals and improved child safeguarding arrangements. In 2017, the Children First National Guidance for the Protection and Welfare of Children was published. Addressing the effects of past abuse has also been a central part of the State's response to historical abuse in residential institutions, with important measures put in place, including the establishment and funding of the HSE's National Counselling Service, providing counselling and support to adults who experience childhood abuse. Over €1 billion in redress payments has been paid by the State to individual survivors of abuse in industrial schools, reformatories and related institutions through the Residential Institutions Redress Scheme and the Education Finance Board. And as part of the State's response, contributions were sought from the relevant congregations. And through Cara Nua, this fund provided €98 million in funding supports to approximately 6,000 survivors. We are now moving to a new phase of supports, which I will expand upon later in this statement. But first I want to say that I fully recognise that for those who suffered institutional abuse, the traumatic impact has been enduring. The deep personal toll that it has taken on the lives of survivors was brought home to me again in my recent engagements with the group who are here today. I was moved to hear each of your personal stories, and I am deeply sorry for the harm that you suffered as a consequence of the abuse that you experienced in state institutions. When we met, you made me aware of the abuse also suffered by many of you who were boarded out, but by you in particular, but many others who were boarded out from industrial and reformatory schools. The issue of how you and other children were treated when boarded out was examined in the Rhine report and is further detailed in Chapter 11 of the report of the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes. Testimony detailed elsewhere in that report conveyed the harrowing experiences of many of those who were boarded out and the palpable sense of abandonment they felt. In January 2021, on behalf of the Government, the State and its citizens, I apologise for the profound generational wrong visited upon Irish mothers and their children who ended up in a mother and baby or county home institution. I also acknowledged then that many children who were subsequently boarded out experienced heartbreaking exploitation, neglect and abuse within the families and communities in which they were placed. As I said at that time, and wish to reiterate today, regardless of the pathway from which individuals were boarded out, this was unforgivable. Government recognised that there were many situations where children in boarded out arrangements were wrongly and harshly treated. They were not raised as part of a family or given the opportunities they should have been in relation to their care and education. We know that some were physically, emotionally and sexually abused. I am very sorry for what was done to you. I apologise on behalf of the State for the abuse and neglect that you suffered. What happened to you was wrong, shocking and should never have happened. The Government recognises the suffering and damage that this abuse has caused, and we will continue to support you as much as possible. As part of that support, and to continue to support people who have experienced abuse while boarded out, the Government established a boarded out practical support service for adults. It is a free and confidential service offering a wide range of practical supports to survivors. Provided by Barnardo's and funded by the State, it delivers practical and therapeutic supports to adults who were boarded out as children in Ireland. Support is also available through the Special Advocate for Survivors, who amplifies the voice of survivors, including those who were boarded out as children. The Advisory Council currently being established by the Special Advocate has a number of pillars to reflect the diverse experiences of survivors. One of these pillars is dedicated to and comprises those who were boarded out. Access to records is also a very important issue for many of those who were boarded out and have questions about their origins and early life experiences. The 2022 Birth, Information and Tracing Act provides a clear legal basis for access to birth and early life information and records. And this allows those who were adopted, boarded out, the subject of an illegal birth registration, or resident in a mother and baby or county home institution as a child to seek information on their own situation. Finally, the National Centre for Research and Remembrance will stand as a national site of conscience to honour equally all those who were resident in institutions and all those who have lived experience of Ireland's historical adoption and voted out systems. Survivors will continue to be at the heart of decisions in relation to the development of the National Centre. In 2023, Government approved a new phase of ongoing supports to survivors of abuse in industrial schools, reformatories and related institutions in areas including health, advocacy and education. This included an enhanced package of health services and supports for those who wish to engage in education and training, and access to advocacy supports through a new independent advocacy service. Work is well underway on putting these services and supports in place. I appreciate that there were concerns amongst certain survivors about the adequacy of these new supports, and this has been the subject of the recent campaign by the group present here today. And following the conclusion of a mediation process to address the concerns raised, Government has agreed to provide further improvements to these services. And these include strengthened access to health services for survivors of industrial and reformatory schools through appointment of dedicated health liaison officers and better access to counselling and physiotherapy services. Work is already underway to put these services in place. Government has also agreed to provide additional funding for education grants under the Supports for Survivors of Residential Institutional Abuse Act 2025. I recognise that there had been calls for a contributory state pension for this group of survivors. I discussed this with survivors and we recognise the complexity of the issue. We agreed to explore ways to address this issue that would be more flexible and easier to access. On foot of this, Government has approved the expansion of the Education Support Payment Scheme under the Act to include provision of support for informal learning, self-development and well-being activities. And these payments will be easy to access and will be introduced as soon as possible. We have also progressed measures to ensure that survivors are prioritised for social housing needs and to ensure that community welfare services give them specific consideration and recognition for funeral costs and provide accordingly. The potential for local memorialisation proposals is also being explored. All of these measures are part of the agreement that I and Minister McEntee and the Government arrived at with the group that's here today by letter and mediation. And I hope that these additional measures will help the ongoing process of healing for these survivors of institutional abuse. Another matter which I wish to address relates to criminal records. Today I wish to categorically confirm for the record that the State did not and does not regard individuals by virtue of their detention in any industrial school as having committed a criminal offence, and that no criminal record is recorded against them. With regard to children who were detained in industrial schools and who were subsequently transferred to a reformatory school solely by virtue of their detention in the industrial school, they are likewise not considered to have had any criminal record. No person, and in particular no agency of the State, should in any way regard these individuals as having committed a criminal offence or having a criminal record. A formal statement to this effect will also be issued today by the Minister for Justice, Home Affairs and Migration. And certificates confirming this for individual survivors will be provided on a case-by-case basis following receipts of records, including posthumously. The process for this will be put in place by the Minister for Justice, Home Affairs and Migration as soon as possible. Survivors have felt stigmatised, and you made this very clear to me in our meetings. You have felt stigmatised throughout your lives, and we must be clear and categoric in removing any taint of stigmatisation from public discourse and the public record. I want to once again thank the survivors for being here today. Your commitment and your resilience and the struggle and the challenges that presented for you personally, as you again articulated to me today, is testament to your tireless commitment to shining a light into the dark corners of both our past and present. I want to unequivocally apologise to you and reiterate on behalf of the Government, the State and all citizens of the State the profound sorrow for the terrible pain and abuse suffered by you. What you endured on a daily basis as innocent children was harrowing, heartbreaking and wrong. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
Ceann Comhairle, I join the Taoiseach in thanking the group of survivors from industrial and reformatory schools for their presence in the Dáil today, and indeed for their campaign to highlight the ongoing legacy of trauma bestowed by this country's shameful history of cruelty towards children. Today we welcome Mary, Miriam and Morris. I know you met with the Taoiseach and Minister McEntee last year, and I know you told your own personal stories, which is a harrowing thing to do in and of itself. But in doing so, you have brought about a renewed focus on the terrible experience of all survivors and a further acknowledgement by the state of the dreadful harm that was done to children. The state has often compounded the wrongs of the past by failing to admit them quickly enough and failing to comprehensively acknowledge our part in them. I can think of too many examples where this has been the case, and I hope today might serve another purpose in helping us to learn from that for once and for all. Today I am glad that we are recognising the hurt and the pain of those abused in childhood in state institutions. Every time the silence that once surrounded your suffering is broken is a moment of light shining in the darkness. We have heard, as we should, in this House on many occasions, of the systematically cold and harsh treatment of children and the endemic culture of abuse which went unchecked in our state for far too long. It is right that we should hear these harsh truths in this House, and it's right that we should apologise for them. In truth, we can never apologise enough for what has happened. In May 1999, the government apologised to the victims of childhood abuse and recognised the acute pain and abuse that children suffered when they should have been cared for and protected by the state. Instead of love and care and protection, they were gravely, gravely wronged. In that apology, it was rightly accepted that abuse ruined their childhood and remained an ever-present part of their adult lives. Although unable to escape the enduring and deep hurt that they carried with them down the years, survivors have demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to sharing their stories, their terrifying living nightmares, so that the state would act. As with the survivors here today, each one of you has their own unique experience of suffering. But I know that through your efforts, you're seeking to improve things for all survivors of institutional abuse. I am sincerely and profoundly sorry for the pain and suffering you were subjected to in and by the state. Today we're building on the state apology of 1999 and all that has followed. Although not yet a member of this House, I remember the Ryan report some 10 years later and the appalling litany of abuse described therein. It is impossible to read the records of abuse reported by witnesses to that inquiry without feeling sick to the pit of your stomach. Not too long after I was first elected, I remember being present in this very chamber after the publication of the Cloyne report, which, though a separate commission process to the Commission to inquire into child abuse, again exposed the disgusting downplaying of the rape and torture of children and a dangerous disregard for child protection practices. I recall being present in this chamber in 2013 for the then Taoiseach's apology to the Magdalene women, as we visited again the cold and pitiless Ireland that was systematically punitive to girls and women. And of course, I remember being present in 2021 when the Taoiseach apologised to those who spent time in mother and baby homes in this country. So many occasions when we have had to once again unleash the national trauma of our past and expose again the wounds which never healed for children afflicted by a culture where indifference enabled violence, neglect and abuse. The dark past of this country is an abyss of misery for the children so victimised. It is right, as I have said, that this House listens and apologises, and more importantly, it is essential that we act. It is true to say extensive work has been undertaken to reform our child welfare laws and ensure that our structures and accountability for child protection are robust and effective. The country held a referendum. People voted to enshrine the best interests of children in our constitution and in our law. Mandatory reporting was introduced. But we must also remind ourselves that when it comes to caring for and protecting for children, we must always be vigilant. We must always seek to improve services and safeguards. Child welfare concerns can never be seen as just a thing of the past. They must be an ever-present priority if we are to be true to the reforms we've made. In addition to the experience of those who were abused in institutions, the Taoiseach also spoke about those who experienced abuse while boarded out. The 2021 State Apology rightly recognised the many situations where children who were boarded out were treated shamefully. Far from being placed into the bosom of a family, Children were neglected and abused and exploited for labour. Today, we clearly and unequivocally, on behalf of the State, apologise to all those who suffered abuse in those circumstances. Today, we confirm on the record of the House that the State did not and does not regard individuals as having committed a criminal offence, and that no criminal record is recorded against them by virtue of their detention in any industrialist school. I appreciate that with the Supports for Survivors of Residential Institutional Abuse Act 2025, we've entered into a new phase of ongoing supports for survivors of abuse, and today we seek to build on those concerns and those supports, as the Taoiseach has outlined, and I welcome that. We hope that the actions we've taken to date, and those that we now take, make some contribution to the healing process for survivors. I hope today's apology can go some way towards that, and that the support of the State can start to make up in some small way for the neglect of the State when you were at your most helpless and most vulnerable. I want to conclude by restating again our deep sorrow for the grievous wrong that was done to you as children. We can never forget that the suffering deliberately imposed on the most blameless innocents is a stain on our nation. We can never stop trying to understand how, as a state and as a society, our most basic instinct to protect our children was warped into an appalling acceptance of abuse and abandonment. I think of a line from the poetry collection The Poison Glen by Anne-Marie Quirin, a collection informed by conversations with survivors of Irish institutions, in her poem Creed. The child, my sister, my brother, who was conceived out of darkness in a moment of light and placed in the care of stone. We unequivocally apologise on behalf of the Government, the State and all the citizens of this State for all that you have endured.
I move to Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald.
The dark shadow cast by what was done to children in Ireland's industrial and reformatory schools is a horror with which our country has never fully reconciled. Indeed, it may be impossible to do so. The scale and depth of the abuse, violence, hurt and life-lasting trauma suffered by victims has rippled and reverberated for decades, sometimes as quiet and uncertain as a whisper, sometimes powerful enough to rock our collective conscience, but always there. The industrial schools were a state-sanctioned system of abuse of vulnerable children, operated on the watch of successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments. Children who needed care and safety were instead met with the most unimaginable cruelty. They were criminalised and victimised, swept under the carpet of society, swept behind iron gates, swept into places of unspeakable brutality. Responsibility for impoverished children was handed to the religious orders, and then a blind eye was turned to the extreme violence inflicted on them. Children whose names were erased with a number, whose innocence was crushed in dark rooms and in grey, cold courtyards, children whose cries for help were drowned out by a depraved cruelty. Not only did the state and successive governments sanction this systematic abuse of children, but it was then covered up, survivors dismissed, their experiences sidelined, their demand for truth and justice ignored. Survivors for too long robbed of their right to say without fear or contradiction, I was there in that place. These awful things were done to me again and again. It was done to me. The way the state chose to look after vulnerable children was to batter, to brutalise and to dehumanise them, and the chosen setting was industrial schools. It would be easy to say that these children were forgotten, but the state and successive governments knew exactly where it had put them, knew the culture of violence that dominated these places, knew the children would be met with cruelty masked as care, the same broken philosophy that gave rise to the mother and baby homes and the Magdalen laundries. We've heard the powerful testimony of many survivors. Yes, it remains hard to comprehend the gravity of the beatings, the sexual abuse, the emotional and mental torture, the excruciating tension of not knowing when that next horror would come, every minute, every hour of every day. Childhoods destroyed, lives ruined, unspeakable damage done. The physical scars run deep, the mental, emotional scars wrapped tightly around every heartbeat and every breath taken. For survivors, this is not a chapter of history because the trauma is with them still today, hardwired perpetually into their lives. 27 years ago, survivors heard a state apology from then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. 3 years later, the Redress Board was set up to provide financial redress to survivors. And then in 2009, the Ryan Report laid bare the shocking endemic nature of abuse in industrial schools. The Residential Institutions Statutory Fund Act was enacted in 2012 to manage contributions, very meagre contributions from religious orders in the areas of housing, health and education. But let it not be forgotten that survivors had to fight and wait years between each step of progress and reparation. Survivors are still fighting for full truth, full justice, full accountability and for the supports they deserve. And that is what brought the 4 survivors of industrial school abuse to the gates of the Dáil last September. For 51 days. Miriam Moriarty Owens, Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy Green and Morris Patton O'Connell protested on a hunger strike outside Leinster House. That is what it took for them to be heard by government. Miriam, Mary, Morris, your demands of a state contributory pension and a HAA medical card to help address the lifelong consequences of the abuse that you and others suffered. Those demands were shamefully ignored by government. You were allowed to go on hunger strike to the point where you developed real, genuine health concerns. I think you deserve an apology for that too. You called off your protest after proposals that were belatedly tabled by the Taoiseach, and I can only hope and pray that the full package of measures is true to those proposals and that government in full follows through on its promises. Maran an trauma ón bhíú só dulling is fortathe in áitina tiun scléacha fós lo sa lá atá inniu ann. Tá an stát agus rialtas in í rialtas freagra as an méid a thorla sna háitina seo. Ní cór go mbeadh ar bhór tháineoirí trid a heile. Today's apology is of course welcome and I hope it brings you some comfort. But an apology without justice is really no apology at all. No child belonged in these places. No child should have endured such suffering, to be beaten and abused only to know that it would happen again, to be demeaned and know that this was allowed, to cry out for help and know that help was not coming. That's the harrowing story of Ireland's industrial schools, a story crafted by the Irish state, overseen by successive governments hand in glove with the religious orders. But today, the dignity, your dignity, of each survivor soars above all of that. You had to fight for far too long. You should never, ever have to fight again.
Darren O'Rourke.
Today's apology is historic and it's important and it is welcome, and I want to acknowledge the survivors who have endured decades of harm, neglect and state failure. We're not dealing with an historic issue here, it is very much live and present, and it's ongoing failure of the state to meet the basic needs of survivors of institutional abuse. And I welcome the apology. I welcome the commitment in terms of the supports and I would encourage that they be in place as quickly as is possible. It's already too late, in my opinion. But to say to Mary, Miriam and Morris, they talk about stigma. You're an inspiration. You've achieved something. It's less than a year ago when I stood here and when now President Catherine Connolly sat over there and brought forward proposals, amendments in line with what you are looking for. And we lost. We were unsuccessful. We didn't deliver it. But you did. You've done that. And it shouldn't have taken your hunger strike, but I have to say it was your resilience, your determination was an absolute inspiration. And you stuck it out and you brought the government to this position. So you should be incredibly proud of yourselves. Your family should be incredibly proud of you. And the whole of Ireland should be very, very proud of you. And it is an inspiration. And we met and we talked and you were incredibly tenacious. You didn't let us or government away with anything. So I will say there's commitments here from government. We need to see them realised. It's a wrong that has to be righted, and I know you will, and we will the same, pursue it to make sure that you get exactly what has been committed to here. As I say, it is very inspirational what you have done. It is a very dark period in Irish history, and those lessons have to be learned, and we need to see that commitment from government to ensure that all of those commitments that have been made are delivered. So to say once again, Cogorgeous live, you should be incredibly proud of yourselves, and I'm inspired by you. Gormil Mag.
And I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak for the Labour Party in today's important and historic debate. I welcome the Taoiseach's apology today, which marks an important step in Ireland's recognition of our shameful history as a society, our history of the appalling treatment of women and children over so many decades. It recognises that far too many of our people were incarcerated in reformatory and industrial schools, in Magdalen laundries and mother and baby homes and other institutions, in what is a very recent and shameful history, and we acknowledge that today. Abuse was systemic, it was known about, it was covered up and brushed under the carpet. And it has taken brave and courageous survivors over many years to shine a light into that dark and shameful history. And I want to acknowledge the mighty M's who are here today. Mary Donovan, Miriam Moriarty-Owens, Mary Dunleavy-Green, Maurice Patton O'Connell. I want to welcome you, I want to welcome your families, your supporters. I know there are many here in the gallery and many watching online. I want to welcome Carmel MacDonald Byrne and so many more. And I want to thank and to acknowledge the late Christine Buckley. Carmel reminds me that it's 30 years this Sunday since Dear Daughter was aired, that groundbreaking documentary made by the late Louis Lenton, in which Christine described her horrific abuse in Golden Bridge. And again, Carmel reminds me, and I had the privilege, I should say, of knowing Christine, who died so sadly in 2014, but Carmel reminds me, Christine said about her appalling experiences of abuse, she said, "We need a year's counselling for every day we spent in those hellholes, those hellholes." And I had the privilege of representing survivors of abuse before the Residential Institution Redress Board in a previous life as a barrister, and I heard firsthand from people about the utterly horrifying experiences they endured, the appalling abuse, the vindictive, systemic, sadistic abuse that they experienced in those institutions. It stays with, I think, any of us who've spoken with survivors, it stays with us all. And I want to thank you all for shining a light into what had gone on for far too long, and as I said, what was known about, what was covered up, what was systemic in so many institutions. It has taken great bravery, it's taken courage of survivors to shine a light, and the campaign has taken far too long. The trauma we know inflicted upon you at such a young age will last a lifetime. And you shouldn't have had to protest so long in this latest stage of seeking justice. Meetings with survivors who were protesting outside Leinster House last autumn should not have been postponed or delayed, because we know delays magnify hurt. I'm glad the protest did culminate in the commitment from government for today's state apology, but the apology must have meaning, it must have impact. And I do welcome, Taoiseach, and Taoiseach, the package of measures you've announced to include financial assistance, prioritised access to social housing, trauma-informed healthcare and education supports. These are welcome. But survivors tell me that they're now keen to get a timeline of when those services will be put in place. They and their families are understandably anxious to know when the commitments will be upheld, when will the services be made available. Clearly, the first important part of continuing to right historical wrongs is the apology today. But we must, all of us, collectively ensure that proper justice, full justice and redress is delivered to provide dignity and closure to a group of people who have suffered for so long. Thousands of children subjected to systemic and sustained abuse at industrial and reform schools going back to the 40s. Physical, sexual, emotional abuse in schools operated largely by religious orders, but funded and supervised by state entities. Neither the Church nor the state intervened to prevent mistreatment. The Catholic Church in particular is known as having acted as a sort of shadow welfare state, operating institutions on behalf of the state abdicating responsibility to vulnerable children. And I'm glad to hear the Minister for Justice is going to make very clear about the absolute lack of criminal record, because far too many of the adults I represented had been sent in through criminal courts, appallingly, criminalised by the state, sent in to suffer criminal abuse at the hands of religious orders in institutions. It's utterly shameful that there are still people living today who had those experiences. So it's long past time that that piece, that justice piece, is dealt with. The Ryan report in 2009, which Taoiseach, you rightly described, that was a watershed moment. And I still remember people coming up in the street, talking to public reps, talking to so many, about the experiences they'd had as children that they had suppressed, but which was brought again into their minds by what the Ryan report revealed. And that was a really important step again in uncovering state complicity as well as religious orders complicity. There was much that was wrong with that redress scheme that I described, the Residential Institution Board, and I think we've learnt from that, and we now know how much we need to ensure enhanced supports and substantive supports are made available to survivors. And I welcome that there will be progress made on the pension point in particular. But Taoiseach, I think there are two forward-facing calls, two forward-facing further points that need to be made. The first relates to our duty as legislators. We need to identify and address gaps in child protection legislation to ensure that our legislation is now robust, is now fit for purpose, and that the state is no longer able to outsource or neglect the care of our most vulnerable in our society. And I'm thinking of those who are still in congregated settings, those children, for example, who come here as unaccompanied minors who are in state care, children in state care in many different settings where again we owe a duty and we must ensure we don't fail again. But the second call is to ensure that the religious orders are made accountable. And I've spoken before about how the churches, but in particular the Catholic Church, enabled a culture of secrecy and cover-up to develop for far too long. How for far too long also church authorities were very slow to pay due redress, that the state paid a huge share of redress despite having been promised that religious orders would engage in delivering justice. The Labour Party has introduced a bill that seeks to address that imbalance, as you know, Taoiseach. Our bill seeks to facilitate civil proceedings against unincorporated bodies such as religious orders. It provides a mechanism for recovering damages from the associated lay-run trusts set up by so many religious orders to hold their assets, so that those assets can no longer be pursued for unpaid redress. Successive governments have repeatedly failed to compel religious orders to pay their fair share of redress, and many continue to evade responsibility. Our Labour bill is now in the lottery for debate in private members' time. It's about ending that evasion and ensuring that religious orders face accountability, and that religious institutions that enabled or ignored abuse for far too long, or enabled the perpetration of abuse for far too long, must be held accountable for the harm that they caused. If we pass this legislation, the Oireachtas has an opportunity to take a meaningful further step towards justice, dignity and truth for survivors, because we cannot simply appeal to the moral duty of religious orders to ensure that victims receive the justice they deserve. We've seen slow pace of action, avoidance of responsibility and legal obfuscations for far too long. To conclude, Taoiseach, I want to state on the record that we owe an enormous debt of appreciation and gratitude to all those brave survivors and victims who've shown such tremendous courage in coming forward to make disclosures, to reveal to us all the true extent of abuse in religious-run and state-run institutions for far too long. I hope that all those survivors and victims and their families watching and listening today will find some solace in today's proceedings. I do welcome the apology, and I do believe we still need to do more to ensure true justice for survivors.
Thank you, Deputy. Now, Deputy Hildegard Naughton. Minister Hildegard
Thank you,
Naughton,
Ceann
excuse
Corla.
me.
And firstly, I too would also like to welcome Miriam Morris and Mary to the House today, together with your family members and your supporters. And I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to meet with you this afternoon. And I understand that days like today are particularly difficult for you and your family, because hearing an apology can bring back such painful experiences. I also recognise how important that this moment is in acknowledging the harm that was done, and it is essential. It's an essential step in honouring your truth and supporting healing for you and those who love you. The abuse and the mistreatment which you, as well as so many other survivors, experienced during their childhoods was horrific and wrong. It is right that this historic wrong has been acknowledged by both the state and the government, and it continues to be acknowledged. It is also right that the state continues to provide supports to survivors to address the legacy of the abuse which has been suffered. As the Taoiseach has already outlined, there has been a significant response by the state to this issue in recent decades, much of which has come under the remit of my department. This includes the investigations undertaken by the Commission to inquire into child abuse, the redress payments made to survivors by the Residential Institutions Redress Board, and funding supports provided by Caranua to over 6,000 survivors in important areas such as health, housing and education. In addition, the National Counselling Service continues to provide much-needed counselling and psychiatry services to survivors of childhood abuse. However, we are now moving to a new phase of the state providing ongoing supports to survivors to meet their key needs. Last July, the Oireachtas passed the Supports for Survivors of Residential Institutional Abuse Act 2025, which will enable the delivery of ongoing health and education supports to survivors of abuse in residential institutions. With regard to health supports, eligible survivors will be provided with a medical card which will enable them to certain health supports and services through the HSE. This entitlement will be for life and will not be subject to a means testing or review. Government has recently agreed to strengthen this package of health supports through the appointment of specified liaison officers within the HSE and through improved access to counselling and physiotherapy services. I understand that the Department of Health is working closely with the HSE to ensure that these supports, including the health liaison officers, are in place as soon as possible. Government has also approved the expansion of the Education Support Payment Scheme to be provided under the Act. This scheme, which will be administered by my department, will provide payments ranging from €500 to €2,000 per year to survivors engaging in education, depending on the level of the course concerned. The scheme will now also provide payments of €600 per year to survivors to support informal learning, self-development and well-being. My department is finalising arrangements so that these important supports for survivors can be delivered as soon as possible. In addition, Sage Advocacy has since November 2023 been engaged by my department to provide advocacy supports to survivors. Sage has appointed regional advocates all across the country to assist survivors who are engaging with relevant service providers such as local authorities and the HSE. Information on the supports available to survivors will be published on the department's website and will also be communicated to survivor and advocacy groups to ensure that as many survivors as possible are made aware of their availability. To Mary, Miriam, Morris and Mary, I say, nothing we do now can ever make up for the harm that you have suffered that was done to you by others who as children you were subjected to horrific abuse while placed in residential institutions. However, it is vital that this harm and its ongoing impact on the lives of survivors is addressed and acknowledged.
Thank you, Minister Jim O'Callaghan.
Ceann Corla. Ceann Corla, I would like to echo and confirm my support for the apology made by the Taoiseach today on behalf of the Government. I would also like to endorse the words of the Taoiseach and the Minister for Education. I share my colleagues' deep sense of regret for the pain and suffering experienced by those who experienced detention in industrial schools. I now want to make, Ceann Comhairle, an official statement as Minister for Justice in respect of people detained in industrial schools. And I know that this is an important official statement for Mary, Miriam and Maurice, and that it will provide them with some solace. As Minister for Justice, Home Affairs and Migration, I confirm that the State did not and does not regard individuals as having committed a criminal offence, and that no criminal record is recorded against them by virtue of their detention in any industrial school. With regard to children who were detained in industrial schools and who were subsequently transferred to a reformatory school solely by virtue of their detention in the industrial school, they are likewise not considered to have had any criminal record. No person, and in particular no agency of the state, should regard these individuals as having committed a criminal offence or having a criminal record. I can also confirm that if individuals wish to have further confirmation that they do not have a criminal record arising from their detention in an industrial school or transfer to a reformatory school solely by virtue of their detention in an industrial school, that confirmation can be provided in the form of a written certificate, including posthumously. Each request for the issuing of a certificate will be considered on a case-by-case basis following receipt and review of records. Again, Ceann Comhairle, I would like to express my sincere sympathies to those who experienced detention in industrial schools and hope that confirmation that the State does not consider these individuals to have a criminal record is a small but meaningful acknowledgement of the need to repair this harm.
Thank you, Minister. We now move to Deputy Dáil.
Yes, Gormagat, Ceann Comhairle, and I just want to seek some sort of clarity in relation to the statement, and before that, to congratulate, in spite of all the adversity that you went through, the efforts that you made against the tide, against the resistance that you faced, and you pushed on through and you got it, and many of you came from Tralee as well. But yeah,
it's his statements, not for
yes.
questions.
So I see in your statement, Taoiseach, on behalf of the government, that you acknowledge and you apologise for the generational wrong. You acknowledge that some children who were subsequently boarded out experienced exploitation, and many of them, boys were sent to work on farms, girls were sent to work in domestic service. And you said in the statement at the time...
Deputy, I'm sorry. I can't permit you to ask a question. I can permit you to continue.
Regardless of the pathway
with your
from
statement.
which individuals are boarded out, you have acknowledged that it's unforgivable, and that's good. And you recognise situations where children were wrongly and harshly treated. And the government recognises the suffering and damage it has caused, and we will continue to support you as much as possible. But people who were boarded out from county homes can't be continued to support because they were never included in any redress scheme. And former Taoiseach Leo Varadkar said that promises will be made, but promises were broken. Something must be done, he said at one stage. So I want to know, are the people who are boarded out from the county homes going to be included in part of any redress scheme? Because it's unclear, I suggest, from what you're saying here, when you're saying that they will continue to support them, because the people that I speak to have not been supported initially. They haven't been included in any redress scheme. So it's impossible to continue to support them when you haven't been doing it, even though you acknowledge the wrong that has been done to them. I think it's important for the thousands of people who were boarded out, because it's so important. It was the state that abandoned, discriminated against, and didn't help those children at every step of the way. And you cannot blame a mother and baby home or any segment of the Catholic Church or any other church for that. It was always the state. And I'd ask you in your closing remarks to clarify whether those children who are now approaching, they're in their 70s, a lot of them don't want counselling anymore, they don't need it, but they do want to be included as part of the redress scheme, and it's important, and I want to know, and they want to know, will they be included?
Thank you, Deputy. Deputy Holly-Kearns.
At the outset, I want to give a very warm welcome to all of the survivors in the public gallery. We're here today because of your tireless efforts to get justice. Cahirlock, I welcome the state apology today for survivors of industrial and reformatory schools, as well as the clarification on criminal records. But I do want to talk about what it took to get here. Survivors of these nightmarish institutions, Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy-Green, Maurice Patton O'Connell and Miriam Moriarty Owens, going on hunger strike for 51 days. Sleeping on the street outside Leinster House in the bitter cold and rain in the winter, just to be listened to be taken seriously, to be heard. These are people who have already been repeatedly failed by the state, who were placed in these terrible institutions when they were just children, only to be beaten, starved and sexually abused, treated like prisoners and slaves, denied a childhood, denied compassion, denied care, denied everything a child needs. They were tortured for years by religious orders and a complicit state. The state knew this was happening and didn't stop it, didn't help, quite the opposite. It continued to send children to these awful places. Children who had suffered trauma and needed love and support were denied it. Instead, all they received was brutality and terror. Every waking minute was marked by fear, anxiety and horror. Lives were destroyed. And we are still, in this chamber, failing them today, decades later, forcing them to beg for supports that should be easy to access, forcing them to jump through hoops just to get the basics, making them feel like they have no other choice but to go on hunger strike. Survivors of depraved abuse forced to endure further trauma and pain, just to get what they should already be entitled to. Cahirlock, today's apology marks the 5th time the state has apologised for what children and women endured in institutions run by religious orders. Those apologies now stretch back nearly 30 years. They started in 1999 when Bertie Ahern apologised to children who had been abused in residential institutions. At the time, Mr Ahern lamented the, quote, piecemeal approach the state had taken to protecting children and commended the, quote, bravery of individual victims determined to tell their stories and seek justice. Back then, Taoiseach, you were Education Minister and Chair of a Cabinet subcommittee tasked with designing supports for victims. Since then, there have been apologies by a further 3 Taoiseach, Brian Cowan, Enda Kenny and yourself, Taoiseach, in 2021. And here we are again today, still forcing victims to go public, to advocate, to fight the state for recognition and services. Still taking a legalistic approach to redress in which the overriding priority is limiting access and eligibility. Once again, trying to protect the state finances rather than trying to protect victims. The redress scheme for the survivors of mother and baby homes is the perfect example of this, to limit support and services to as narrow a group as possible for entirely arbitrary reasons that have no scientific or logical basis, causing further pain and trauma to survivors who have already suffered so much in the process. The state didn't do this in the dim or distant past. It was a decision by the previous Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and Green Party government. You excluded children who had spent less than 6 months in one of these institutions and children who had been boarded out, even if those children had been forcibly separated from their mothers or illegally adopted or treated like slave labour and abused in the places that they were boarded out to. They got nothing. I hope that the brave people who went on hunger strike are not failed by this government too. I know that they feel angry and let down that supports they were promised have not materialised. Taoiseach, survivors being consulted about the apology 30 minutes beforehand and the dates of their coming and going from the institutions being wrong today is insulting and it is disrespectful, and the very least they deserve today is respect. I hope this doesn't continue beyond today.
Deputy Cummins.
Curvmagat, Mary, Miriam, Mary and Morris, you should never have had to fight this hard to hear the words that you did today. And we should never have met outside Leinster House when you were outside on hunger strike, in the cold, in the dark, alone, like you were so many times as children. That should never have happened. You should never have had to endure that. I would like to thank you all for entrusting me with your stories. It broke my heart the first time I met you, and it still breaks my heart today. I'm sorry for getting emotional, but it is on your behalf, because what you have endured as children and what you are enduring today is actually just heartbreaking. And as Deputy Kearns has just said, to know that your entry and exit dates were incorrect is wrong. And the other thing that's wrong is the fact that you all have to go home tonight because you weren't put up for the night here in Dublin, and you're far to travel, and it's an emotional day. That should not have happened to you either. I want to congratulate you for the work that you've done. You have been amazing. And as Deputy O'Rourke have said, you were inspirational. And I hope you find today that you find some peace for the remainder of your lives, and the things that have been promised to you, I hope that they're delivered and timely, because it's 3 months since you came off that road and they're still not delivered. And I wish you the very best of luck, and I hope today has helped you heal in some little way.
Deputy Quaid.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Taoiseach, I want to pay tribute to all industrial and reformatory school survivors and to those who have not lived to hear today's state apology. One apology in a series to those who have suffered terribly in state institutions that will ring hollow if it is not followed quickly by the enactment of commitments you made to the group of survivors we have here today last November. I connected with Mary Dunleavy Green, Mary Donovan, Miriam Moriarty Owens and Maurice Patton O'Connell during their 51-day protest outside Leinster House, and in particular with Mary Dunleavy Green through our shared County Limerick roots. And I look forward to meeting Mary in Kilteely, County Limerick, in the coming months. I was deeply struck by the determination and commitment to justice shown by these survivors on behalf of all who endured our hellish industrial and reformatory school system. We may have moved on, Cathaoirleach, from the savage abuse and abject deprivation that defined our industrial and reformatory schools, but too often this has given way to a cold, bureaucratic system that meets survivors not with respect and compassion, but with delay, resistance or indifference when they try to access healthcare, basic financial supports and measures that would bring a modicum of comfort to their lives. Taoiseach, I'm imploring you to act on the commitments you made to the survivors last November with the greatest urgency.
Deputy Minister Foley.
Today is an important moment in facing up to a traumatic time in our history. This state was established with the intention of moving away from the cruel and harsh regime that vulnerable children experienced in workhouses. But after independence, many of these vulnerable children remained in the workhouses, which were renamed as county homes. Others were put into orphanages, industrial schools and reformatory schools, or boarded out to families. Successive tribunals and commissions of investigation have established that many of the children did not get the love, care and security that they deserved, and worse again, many experienced severe abuse. This legacy of abuse and neglect of children has caused deep trauma, which is still with survivors today. I had met with Miriam Moriarty Owens, Mary Dunleavy Green, Mary O'Donovan and Maurice Patton O'Connell on a number of occasions, including during their time outside Leinster House, and I am truly conscious of the trauma that they and other survivors have endured and continue to endure. As they're aware, the issues were raised directly with An Taoiseach and the Minister for Education, and I welcome the fact that mediation talks, coupled with the genuine personal commitment of An Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, and most especially The determination and courage of the group of 4 survivors paved the way for today's outcome. On that note, I really don't believe we should ever underestimate the determination of Miriam, Maurice and the 2 Marys and their absolute commitment to achieve today's success, not just for themselves, but for all the others who experienced what they experienced, lived what they live, and indeed live what they live today. From the outset, I was struck by that sense of solidarity and generosity that drove Miriam, Mary, Maurice and Mary on, and I think all in this House thank them for that. I welcome the apology the Taoiseach has made here in the Dáil to survivors of institutional abuse and those who suffered abuse while they were boarded out. This apology builds on the 1999 apology to victims of institutional abuse and aspects of the 2021 apology to survivors of mother and baby homes. From speaking with survivors, I know many worried that they may have a criminal record just by virtue of having been in an industrial school or in a reformatory school. The Taoiseach and also today the Minister for Justice has restated the official position that no such criminal record exists. This reassurance is important for survivors and I welcome it. Today is a day when the State rightly says sorry for the failings of the past. Every day we must work with dedication and determination to ensure those past failures are not repeated in the present and into the future. There has been huge reform of our child welfare and protection system over past decades. There are vetting procedures and avenues of support in place which did not exist in the past. However, we cannot shy away from the fact that there are still some children in our society who remain at risk. As a state and as a society, we must continue to do everything in our power to protect and support all children, especially those who are most vulnerable. I wish to conclude by again saluting the courage of Maurice Patton O'Connell, Miriam Moriarty Owens, Mary Dunleavy Green and Mary O'Donovan. To them, we say thank you. Gormagat.
Mr. McEntee.
Thank you, and Lascan Corley. Like my colleagues here, I am pleased to have the time to contribute to this state apology, and I want to acknowledge the words of the Taoiseach, the Taoiseach, and many of my colleagues here in apologising for the great harm that was done to so many young people, to so many families over such a prolonged period of time at the hands of the state. The Taoiseach's apology today rightly built on the 1999 apology on behalf of the state and its citizens to all survivors of childhood abuse, taking into consideration the 2021 apology to survivors and former residents of the mother and baby institutions, but in particular today we reference and we relate to those who were boarded out from the various institutions, many of whom were children, many of whom suffered unimaginable abuse at the hands of those who were meant to protect them and to support them. Today we also refer to the criminal records and make it very clear that no person has a criminal record by virtue of having been in an industrial school, and I know that this is an important element of the apology today. We make reference to the important initiatives, as we've heard from colleagues, which have taken place in recent decades, including the work of the CICA, improvements to child protection and the provision of redress and other supports. And it's important today as well to recommit to and to acknowledge the new and necessary ongoing supports that will be delivered to survivors. I really want to, in particular today, acknowledge 4 people who I believe have brought us to this point and who have made today happen. Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy Green, Miriam Moriarty Owens and Maurice Patton O'Connell, and I know that they represent many, many other survivors of institutional abuse and of our industrial schools. I met all 4 in my previous role as Minister for Education, and I really want to thank them for the time that they afforded me in our engagement and during our time, because I'm very conscious that I am not the first person that they had to relay their story to and the horrors that were inflicted upon them, their siblings, their family members, the intergenerational trauma that has been inflicted on them and their communities. And it is only through their bravery, their determination, not just to ensure that the wrong that was inflicted on them, that it's recognised here today, but the wrong that was inflicted on so many others, that is recognised here today. And so we all must take this opportunity to restate our absolute commitment as legislators, as public representatives, working together to make sure that these kind of abuse, that they do not happen again, and that no young person, that no family will ever be subjected to the kinds of abuse that we know were inflicted on so many young people through no fault of their own. So again, I welcome the Taoiseach's apology here today. I welcome the Taoiseach's apology, and I join with colleagues in thanking in particular Mary, Miriam and Maurice for what they have done and what they have achieved on their own behalf, but on behalf of so many others as well.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Sophie Clark.
Thank you, Last Count Corla. Miriam Moriarty Owens, Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy Green and Maurice Patton O'Connell. Those 4 courageous survivors of abuse in industrial schools who undertook a hunger strike for 51 days outside this very building did not do that lightly. They done it as the last act, the last resort. These survivors, already failed in childhood by the state and religious authorities, felt compelled to place their own health at risk simply to have their voices heard. And all for very modest demands, including a HAA card so that they can access medical care without additional financial hardship, a contributory state pension acknowledging the years of their unpaid labour carried out in the institutions. Government after government acknowledged wrongs but failed to implement fully comprehensive survivor-centred redress. The supports for survivors of residential institutional abuse of 2025 in reality was a half measure that ignored the unmet need of all survivors. Sinn Féin brought forward amendments at the time seeking to make that bill equal for all survivors of residential institutions, and all of our amendments were struck down by government. The 2025 Act failed to guarantee universal access to that HAA card. It didn't provide a contributory state pension in recognition of that unpaid institutional labour. It created eligibility thresholds that excluded survivors based on technicalities, and it introduced layers of bureaucracy that placed undue burden again on survivors to prove their suffering. A survivor centre scheme would have ensured universal inclusion for survivors regardless of what institution they were in or the institution's religious ethos. That was not survivor centre, it was bureaucracy centred. It created a hierarchy of pain based on arbitrary lines. Survivors of institutional abuse were failed as children by religious orders and by the state, by the very systems meant to protect them. And they carried the consequences of that for a lifetime. Enduring trauma, an indelible mark was put upon them by those in authority, criminalised. The state now has an opportunity and an obligation to move beyond symbolism and deliver concrete, equitable, survivor-centred supports and a timeline for the delivery of them. All commitments must be delivered. Justice must be delivered. But an apology has to be the beginning, not the end, because an apology without justice is hollow and empty. And those 4 people sitting in our chamber today, and all the others like them, deserve so much more than that.
Deputy Ruth Coppinger.
Thanks, Curlock. Well, we have all the bigwig ministers here, but I think a few things have to be stated very honestly. That 4 survivors were left outside there for over 40 days, and only for Miriam Moriarty Owens, Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy, Maurice Patton O'Connell, suffering their health as well. There wouldn't have been anything at all given. And I remember I raised this on the floor of the Dáil. I think Catherine Connolly, who's now the President, raised it in Leaders' Questions. I think I raised it in promised legislation the same day. And the answer we got back was that we're not giving in to blackmail, emotional blackmail. It was, yeah. But I just want to say, I want to clarify what has been conceded to the survivors. So I was just checking whether I put my glasses on a couple of times to check this. So instead of a pension, they're being given a yearly payment of €600. Is that correct? Because €4 a week, and we're expected to think that that's okay. Bearing in mind the free labour they did in that was done in reformatory schools. there was a whole host of things that seemed to have been discussed and asked for by the survivors and not given. And also, they make the point that there's 4,000 others who are looking for lifelong supports that they still haven't got. I'm struck as well that everything that's been given, like you go on about one-off payments during the cost of living, these are all one-off measures so that they don't exist for other people as well. Well, a pension is not €600 a year is an insult. In fairness, that should be looked at again. I just want to pay, homage to them for their determination and, their consistency in raising this issue. And just to acknowledge that once again, people who've been the victims of the church-state nexus, because many people, I had first cousins of my own mother who were in reformatory schools that we all only found out about much later in life. We didn't know anything about them. And they had lifelong suffering and torment as a result of what they experienced there. And I don't think that that's fully acknowledged at all by what has been given. The damage to people's health, the damage to people's psychological and physical health. And, once again, I think the Irish state is covering up for its role in past abuses.
Murphy.
Thanks, Karen Corlin. We were child slaves. We got very little portions of food. We were deprived of every human right. A capitation grant was paid by the state to the religious orders to keep us there. They gagged us. We weren't allowed to speak afterwards or name an institution or a perpetrator. The words of Mary Dunleavy Green, one of the hunger strikers who fought for redress from the government for its part and the state's part in its abuse. I mean, the horrors can't be overstated. I remember going out to meet with them when they were bravely on their hunger strike, not seeing any road in terms of justice, and just the horror that these people went through for which the state was responsible. And therefore it's welcome that the state gives an apology, but it absolutely has to be followed by action. And I do think, we can't just forget how long it took to get to this point, not just in years, but in terms of the days, 46 days of the hunger strike for a mediator to be put in place, 51 days for the government to commit to work with the hunger strikers in relation to their very simple demands, including the award of a Health Amendment Act card, a state contributory pension for the abuse that they suffered in their childhood, and in line, to be clear, and this is the point they always made, in line with what had been offered to other survivors of similar institutions. It's good the government has announced supports for survivors. It has been very, very long. They're not all in place now. They need to come in place. If they're not, we will be putting very significant pressure in here to make sure that they do, and they're not forced to contact us to say, we keep hearing that things are going to be resolved and things don't seem to be resolved. There's around 4,000 living survivors of abuse in industrial schools. They can't be made to wait. They have to get this, the very, very least that they're entitled to. I also want to raise a related issue of abuse which has been ignored, which is the historic abuse that occurred in psychiatric hospitals. I've been speaking to Mary Donovan about her mother, Margaret Mary Donovan, who was institutionalised for nearly her entire life. She spent over 50 years in both state-run and religious institutions across Ireland from the age of 16. In 1966, nursing notes said, quote, "There appears to be very little wrong mentally with her, yet she remained institutionalised." Included in the allegations against these psychiatric institutions are mistreatment, rape and forced labour. The abuse also severely impacted the life of Mary's brother Christopher, who had spent over 20 years in a psychiatric hospital and died there in 2007. The abuse he had suffered saw him go from what was described as a big man to a skeleton and develop numerous other issues, including schizophrenia. There's no inquiry in place in relation to psychiatric institutions. There's no redress has been offered, no apology has been offered. This issue is coming. The government should get ahead of it, address it, inquiry into it, and not force another group of people to have to protest for a basic recognition of This issue is coming. The government should get ahead of it, address it, inquiry into it, and not force another group of people to have to protest for a basic recognition of the wrongs that the state did to them and an apology.
Deputy Minister Marlene O'Connor.
Thank you, Lisa Cairn-Corley, thank you very much. So, I very much welcome the government's apology today to the survivors of abuse in residential institutions. This apology builds on the state's apology to all victims of childhood abuse made in May 1999 and also takes into consideration the 2021 apology to survivors and former residents of the mother and baby institutions. This apology comes as we reflect on one of the darkest chapters of our history, a chapter we must look back on and learn from. On the 22nd of September last year, a number of brave, determined and committed survivors began their hunger strike outside Leinster House, including a courageous lady from my own constituency of Carlow Kilkenny, Mary Dunleavy Green. When I met with the group of survivors while they were on hunger strike in September, I was deeply impacted by their account of their own childhood and struck by how they had been strong enough to carry on, yet also recount those horrific times in order to tell their stories again and again and again. While I am glad that the government has issued this long-awaited apology today, I hope it can bring you some level of comfort, and I am under no illusion that it can never undo the horrific experience of your past and the harm that each of you sustained in the hands of the state. Following engagement with the Taoiseach and the then Minister for Education and Youth, Helen McEntee, the group ceased their protest on the 10th of November. The mediation process concluded in December. Arising from this mediation process, the Government has also approved proposals to strengthen education and health supports for survivors, which are to be delivered under supports of Survivors of Residential Institutional Abuse Act 2025, which passed last July. A very important aspect of today's apology is that it relates in particular to those who were boarded out from relevant institutions. This apology underlines the fact that those who were victims of this industrial abuse, who were criminalised for so long, do not have a criminal record and will not now be viewed as criminals by the state. A number of other issues, including housing and funeral costs, are also being addressed by the relevant departments so that survivors can be provided for. Work is ongoing to deliver on commitments given, and further details will be provided to survivors as soon as possible. It is nothing less than what ye deserve, and I want to commend ye all for your determination and resolve. What happened to you was wrong. The suffering that you endured as children was wrong, and the impact this has had on your entire lives is wrong. Thank you.
I want to welcome this apology. I think our state was founded on very lofty principles, and many of them have been delivered, but so many of them have not. And during the last century, the state fell short in terms of delivering for its citizens, and this is one example of that. I think it's extremely important, and I met these people, I think in September, outside the Dáil. I want to acknowledge the courage that it took for them to take the steps they did, and I'm glad that it has resulted in a conclusion for them, or a closure of some sort for them, and an apology which I think is merited and appropriate, and I welcome the fact that it's come. I do, however, think we are sometimes too slow to apologise. As a state, I understand there are legal considerations and liabilities and all the rest, but at the end of the day, we know that there are instances in our past which constitute a stain on the history of this state, for which we should be sorry, for which I think we are genuinely sorry, and yet bureaucratically we are slow to apologise for. We should not be. When we know something is wrong, we should be willing to stand up and say as much, whether that is as a government or as an individual citizen. We should be able to acknowledge the harms that were done by the state and by our society in the past, and we should be faster, we should be quicker and swifter in acknowledging that, because it's only in that way that we can start to heal the damage that was done by it. And while I welcome this apology, there are many other instances where apologies are sought and not yet forthcoming. One issue, and I don't propose to talk about it particularly now, is but thalidomide survivors, who are also awaiting a real solution. But I acknowledge the work that's been done by the Taoiseach of the Taoiseach in meeting them, and I hope that they will progress that quickly. But I think the most important thing about what we are talking about today is that we as a polity and we as a state genuinely take on board what has been done in the past that was wrong, hurtful and damaging. Acknowledge it by a proper state apology the way we have received today, and allow everyone, not just the survivors, because they will move on and they will live their lives, but we as a state cannot move on until those apologies are made. So I applaud the fact that the apology has been made. I welcome it. I welcome the package that has been put together, and I congratulate those who put it together. But when this issue comes up, as it will again, let's do it more swiftly. Let's be fair to the people who are wronged by the state and make sure they get what they need and what they deserve.
Deputy Pottery.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Childhood memories should be nuggets of joy and flashbacks of events, evoked by smells, words and actions of others of happier times. They should make us laugh and smile when we remember. They should be a guide for us when if and when we are lucky enough to have our own children. They should be around us like a cosy duvet on dark, miserable days. Some of us can point to a teacher who is inspirational, stern, strict, batty or just simply kind. I remember Mrs. Bell, who handed out silver mints when trying to get us prepared for our first communion, or Mrs. McKeown, who would take us outside to do our lessons on sunny days. Not all days were great days, but they were certainly nowhere near the experiences of these brave people who have shared their stories and experiences of horrid abuses. Their childhood memories are marred in darkness as a result of the abuse inflicted on them by the very people that should have had their best interests at heart. Abused by people who had no regard for the duty of the care to these children. Abused by people who feared no repercussions for their actions. Abused by people who were possibly admired and respected for how they handled unruly or problematic children or for how they ran their schools. They abused children. Children who were seen but not heard. Children who would not or could not dare utter a word of what was happening to them. Children who were not believed. Children abused by monsters. That we, the state, offer an apology is not only right, it is long, long overdue. To those who have suffered, I am sorry. I am so, so sorry that you have had to not only have to experience these abuses, but that you've had to wait so long to be heard.
Deputy Anne Graves.
Taoiseach, Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy Green, Maris Patton O'Connell and Miriam Moriarty were forced to go on hunger strike for 51 days and nights outside this building in attempt for justice, from September the 21st until November the 10th, sleeping on the streets outside here in appalling conditions, appalling weather. Their meagre possessions were stolen in what's supposed to be safe Dublin, and they did it to represent the other survivors. I had the privilege of supporting them by raising their case in this House at the beginning of November last. And during my contribution, I pleaded with you to go out, Taoiseach, and meet the hunger strikers and to agree with their reasonable demands. The survivors have been deeply traumatised by institutional abuse they suffered, and they were re-traumatised by government's lack of engagement and response. And then they faced the psychological and health issues following their hunger strike. Their courage, strength and sacrifice in undertaking a hunger strike was not for themselves alone, but for all survivors. They undertook the protest not just for them, but for the 4,000 survivors of residential institutional abuse. And their demands were simple. A state contributory pension to acknowledge the years of unpaid labour carried out in institution where children were forced to work without remuneration, education or protection, and a Health Amendment Act card to help address the lifelong consequences of the abuse they suffered in these industrial and reformatory schools. While Taoiseach, your apology is very welcome, survivors have experienced decades of lip service. Successive governments have recognised the wrongs while failing to implement comprehensive survivor-centred solutions. Trust in government and the powers that be have been eroded by decades of inaction. Only decisive action can now change this. The Support for Survivors of Residential Institutional Abuse Act 2025 is introduced by this government. The Act is a half measure that ignores the needs of survivors. We, Sinn Féin, brought forward amendments to this legislation that sought to make the bill equal for all survivors, but they were struck down by this government. Our amendments included a universal health card, contributory state pension, educational bursaries, religious orders financial contribution and equal access to all supports under the Act, regardless of whether survivors had received an award or settlement. That's the very least that survivors should expect. Significant concerns remain that the legislation is incomplete and does not fully address the lived realities of survivors of institutional abuse. The state continues to shield religious orders from their financial responsibility. It's unacceptable that the state alone should foot the bill for crimes committed by both church and state. Justice delayed has already been justice denied. For survivors of institutional abuse, immediate and decisive action must follow tonight's apology to make it valid.
Thank you, Lás Ceann. I want to just address Lás Ceann, Mary Donovan, Mary Green, Miriam and Morris, who I suppose over 51 days became more than just acquaintances. We almost became, I suppose, friends every day as I was passing to my office in Agricultural House, stopping for a cup of coffee. Many, many times I witnessed an ambulance outside, taking one of them away. 51 days where people, normally 70 plus average, had to go out on the street to fight for what was theirs. No, the fair thing about it is that these people are survivors. These people have proven themselves over and over again that they can rise from the ashes because they've gone through it all their lives. They've fought all their lives against sexual abuse, and I'm talking about the 4,000 others, sexual abuse, child slavery, mental abuse and physical abuse. People rang me that I had never met from all over the country that were victims of this abuse and told me their stories, told me how they had planned to travel to Australia when they were in their 30s, 40s, how they had planned to travel to the United States but were afraid to even apply because they were feared they may have a criminal record. And now today, in 2026, and you know, when the best of years are behind you, and that's the truth, they're being told you don't have a criminal record. 1999 is when we first issued the apology. And yet we're here 27 years later, Taoiseach, 27 years later, issuing another apology because we didn't do it correctly in the first place. And, you know, that beggars belief, that we are not apologising for things that we got wrong in this state. And nobody's blaming you directly, Taoiseach, or your government. These things that happened in the past. We have to be able to say, this is what happened in the past. We have to be able to say, we need to take responsibility for what happened in the past, and we need to correct that. And yet, we're here 27 years later, since 1999, since the first apology. This should never be here. These people should have been able to go out the door in 1999 with the apology, accepted it, and have all the redresses. And I have to say, I listened to comments being made here in the House today, and I'm going to address that because some of it made my stomach churn. It really did. Because I got to know these people very well. And these are honourable people. These are trustworthy people. These are people that I could tell my darkest secret to. We've known one another now for quite some time over the phone and chatting back and forth. And these are people that I could tell the darkest secret to because they're the trustworthy people. They're honourable. So when they tell me that something happened to them or something was said inside in a room by an official, I believe them. And I have to say, when one person stands up here and issues their apology, but yet at a negotiation went outside the door and made jokes and laughed at certain people's conditions and said a bit of a hunger strike wouldn't be too bad on one or two of them. When those comments are made, and I have to salute them here because they shook our hand today, because I couldn't. It disgusted me, the comments that were made here today. Because I know for facts from these people, from listening to these people, and I know the trustworthy of these people. When they tell me that story, I have to salute you because you shook her hand today as she went out the door. I couldn't do it. Well done. And that just shows you that there's honour and decency in these people, and they should never have been treated like that. Never. And Taoiseach, you've mentioned here you will explore, on page 8, you've used the word explore twice on page 8 of your address. Please do not explore anymore. Give them what they're entitled to, and fairness and honesty, and let them go on and have some sort of quality of life, and put this awfulness behind them. Thank you, Count.
Mr. Butler.
Thank you, Laskin Corla. I stand today to add my support to the state apology to the victims of horrendous abuse in industrial and reformatory schools. There are not enough words to outline the abuse, the absolute horror suffered by these survivors and all victims of abuse. Many of those lived and suffered in silence. They suffered the stigma for decades, and they have struggled with pain and anguish. These were children placed in industrial schools. We know they suffered the most horrendous mistreatment, but they had courage and conviction, especially those who undertook a lengthy hunger strike outside the gates to ensure their most awful experiences were finally heard. They shared their lived experience. They still share their living experience. And I hope today is one of the better days of your living experience. I want to mention Mary Donovan, Mary Dunleavy-Green, Miriam Moriarty-Owens and Maurice Patton O'Connell. I met Maurice a few years ago, and Maurice is the parent of his son Jason, who is upstairs there looking down. And I met Maurice when his son was overprescribed medication in South Kerry Cams. Maurice has outlined Jason's lost years as a result of the overprescribing. And Maurice, during really difficult times for himself, put his family first to advocate for them. And I'll always remember his powerful advocacy in relation to children that were harmed in Kerry. I do hope the government's response to what happened in Kerry will deliver for Jason and others, and they can go on and have better years. I can only imagine the horror that Maurice is enduring in having to fight the state on two fronts. But as a minister, I am committed to doing whatever I can to right the wrongs of mental health services in Kerry, and the government is determined to recognise the trauma of what Maurice, the two Marys, Miriam, what you all endured with the apology and the package of supports for survivors. We are committed to a strengthened suite of supports, extending access to tailored health services, counselling, physiotherapy, education payments and compassionate assistance in housing and funeral costs. We are totally committed. I do hope these measures can meet the very real needs raised by survivors and reflect the state's responsibility to respond meaningfully. The state has also affirmed that no survivor should ever be regarded as having a criminal record simply because they were placed in an industrial school. And Minister O'Callaghan will also, and has already, issued formal, and he has clarified this, and he will issue formal certificates to confirm this. As these commitments are implemented, this moment must represent more than an apology. It must be a turning point, one grounded in dignity, justice, and a continuing duty to ensure survivors receive the compassion and support that you deserve. What happened to you all was wrong, and I hope today brings some small comfort to you all. Thank you very much.
Minister Canny.
Thank you, Laskin Corla. I believe it is very clear from today's contributions that this country has, in the past, often failed to treat people equally, and it has failed to look after the most vulnerable, especially vulnerable children. In sending vulnerable children to state institutions run by religious orders, in many cases, we left them unprotected and open to abuse at the hands of those who are supposed to help them and protect them. The Ryan report outlines to a full and heartbreaking extent just how much these vulnerable children suffered abuse and neglect under the harsh institutional regimes. I know that nothing can ever be said or done to unravel the pain and suffering that ensued from these abuses. I previously stated my vision for Ireland that it is a place where our children and grandchildren can build a decent life for themselves, where all people are treated equally, and where our society looks after the most vulnerable. For the survivors present here today, I want to say to you that I understand how much this past has been a real and lasting impact on all stages of your lives. In reality, in the vast majority of cases, children ended up in these institutions simply because they were and their families were poor. In more recent times, we've recognised the huge detrimental impact that poverty can have on our children's lives, and I welcome the concerted efforts across the system to tackle child poverty. The importance of this focus is recognised in the establishment of the Child Poverty and Wellbeing Programme Office in the Department of the Taoiseach in 2023 to prioritise actions across government in areas that would have the greatest impact for children and families experiencing poverty. This is important work, and as a government we must continue to focus on our work to make significant positive changes for families and children who experience poverty. The Taoiseach and Taoiseach has spoken today about the many ways in which we have extensively changed and improved our childcare and child protection systems. It is important that we acknowledge the progress made while recognising the importance of continuing vigilance for vulnerable children. Today, we also again recognise the plight of those children who suffered abuse while boarded out. The abuse and neglect that some children experience while boarded out was truly unforgivable, and the State rightly apologises to you today for what you endured. It is also fitting that we are clearly and unequivocally clarifying the position that the State did not and does not regard individuals as having committed a criminal offence, and that no criminal record is recorded against them by virtue of their detention in an industrial school. Likewise, any children who were detained in industrial schools and who were subsequently transferred to a reformatory school solely by virtue of their detention in the industrial school, they are likewise not considered to have a criminal record. The full range of additional supports being put in place for survivors of institutional abuse have been outlined here today. I want to especially welcome the fact that access to health services for survivors of industrial schools will be strengthened through the implementation of bespoke arrangements for this specific group of survivors, including access to counselling and physiotherapy services. I note that many of the services provided on the HAA card are already available under the Enhanced Medical Card for survivors of residential institutional abuse. It is also very welcome that additional health liaison offers will be put in place to support this group of survivors. I understand that arrangements are in train to have these additional supports in place as soon as possible. In conclusion, today is another important chapter in facing up to our past and our ongoing efforts to address the terrible impact on survivors of institutional abuse. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes our statements on the apology related to childhood abuse, hunger strikers, and the Dáil now stands adjourned for 1 hour.